you know that many of the videos have created a lot of controversy and led many people to actually think that possibly we're leading people down a scriptural misunderstanding of some sort. But morals and conscience kind of bring that whole idea of grayness or what is right and wrong to a very, very big clarity. The idea of subjection to the higher powers, Romans 13, also Romans 13 verse 5, which is said to be basically subject for conscience sake. And conscience is a moral thing because we know that the only power that anything could ever have would only come from the supreme source. And so therefore, how more subject could you be than if you took a position that was given you or gifted you at birth, which would have been to be under the protection of the higher powers as it would have been for any child. It's the parents who generally do not understand that they may be not guiding the child properly in the idea of the social insurance or the social security gambit, the idea of going into a third-party liability and into a participation they didn't need to do themselves. And so their child is still protected under the government, but they're allowed to guardian that child until they fail or they do something that could violate any civil law. And therefore immediately it's so quick that the child is taken away. It's really the document that's taken away or the authority over the child with the document that's taken away. But did the parents still fail? Most likely yes, and we know people have had atrocities over these things, and we're not going to say that we don't have empathy over circumstance that has occurred, but many of the things that have occurred to many people that have experienced badly within the law is because they were civil participants. This video is based on telling people that when we're talking about being subject for conscience sake, we're conscientious objectors, so therefore we're allowing ourselves to receive a remedy of conscientious objection, non-participation, because we were already gifted non-participation based on our Christian position and based on the death of Christ. And therefore Christians are to be civilly dead. They are not to be armed. They are to be peacemakers. They are not to be involved in occupation and war. And all the occupation that is out there currently is destroying the planet. So please do not tell me that you're serving some useful purpose out there, because it's all part of an aggregate that unfortunately is destroying everything. So whether I'm involved in this, that, or the other thing, involved in commerce, all of this aggregated together is continuing the problem, which is allowing the occupation of everybody's independent interests to actually destroy the planet with everything that it has, whether it's its trees, its water, its air. It's all being destroyed based on man just won't rest. He is at unrest. And there is no amount to satisfy the direction of those that are involved in the unrest. So we're able now to kind of take you to another direction here, which is dealing with the word voluntary. Now, I took a lot of notes the other day, and I like when we kind of talk somewhat off the cuff here, able just to go back, and I'm sharing with you things that I found through research, and I'll give you as much as I can on this, because the word volunteer is a very important word here. We were not volunteers when your parents placed you in this. So consider this as almost like a draft almost. But were you really conscripted here? Or were you prescripted with a remedy? A prescription and then the remedy, the drug. Which would have been, of course, what we call the wallet size short form. And I kind of relate to it more as a civil death certificate. Not a death certificate as they would issue at the end when someone actually stops operating through the social insurance program, stops operating the driver's license, stops operating all those things. Because when all those things wipe out, when someone dies physically, they cancel all those things. That's what most people would consider to be the death certificate, but I'm saying in reality it's more like a stillborn certificate. And you really need to go into what the word stillborn means. And to understand that, maybe we'll get a chance in this video to do that. I'll take you into the law book, give you the rendering of what that is, and then you'll understand. But civil death basically would be very close to the word stillborn. So in the understanding of voluntary, you didn't volunteer. So when your parents filled this out, you weren't volunteering anything. Nothing could have harmed you. And they reviewed it, and they know that a child cannot be born armed. According to law, no man can be born armed. Webster's 1828 will even define the word unarmed as a man is born unarmed. Well, then you can't be armed if you're born unarmed. So you got to be armed later. And that's what walking into the service is all about. Now, we know in the jurisdiction I'm talking about, I was born within the province of Ontario, the government, or the country of Canada, and therefore they had Service Canada and Service Ontario, which would indicate the fact that if I'm going there to do something, then I must be in service. Now, a child can never consent to be involved in a war. They would never draft a child. Therefore, all this is quite symbolic, but we know that the cup of Christ was also called a draft. And so, therefore, the cup of Christ is on this, but really off the record. Because they will never admit, because they could not try a Christian according to Scripture and according to law. You could not do that. You could not try anybody who's in that following because he paid for that jurisdiction. So, in this situation, this is based on involuntary. And in fact, they define that a stillborn child has no voluntary heartbeat. No voluntary heartbeat. Isn't that interesting? No voluntary muscle. How could a child have a voluntary muscle? Of course it would be involuntary. So therefore, when they're defining what would be a stillbirth, even though they've only said that this is a birth certificate, it could still be considered in law possibly either or. So therefore, most likely this is dealing with, as it would have the rendering with the name in reversion, a civil death certificate. That's how they bought the dead back from the train, civilly dead. Uniquely enough, the statement of birth almost looks like train tracks on the Ontario version of this statement. Looks like railroad tracks. We also call in law, when you push something through legislation for a reason, it's railroaded. Doesn't mean it's right, it's just it's done for the purpose of what they consider to be the public good, so they railroad legislation through. But at the same end, he who commits the tort must provide the remedy. So they provided the remedy, here's the drug, here's the prescription. Done. So, in the word involuntary, we can understand where that would come from. So the certificate they're only talking about, in reality, on the Vital Statistics Act, is only relating to involuntary, not voluntary. And therefore, the only certificate they're talking about is only dealing with, most likely, the stillbirth certificate, not what we consider to be a certificate of live birth. And in fact, they're not even defining this under the idea certificate, because the birth record, the long form or the statement of birth for Ontario, is not defined in their Vital Statistics Act as a certificate. It's considered to be a registration, but not considered a certificate. So the only certificate that they're talking about is actually the more ambiguous one that just says name, which really doesn't define who they're talking about. And dealing with the idea of civil death makes total sense. Because whoever's on there has not been born again, has not come to this knowledge, and therefore would be living in the spirit, not in, which would be more so living in substance, not in form. So the word involuntary says not done of one's own free will. Well, we know that wouldn't have been done there. There's no free will involved in this. Whatever's done there is done ahead of time. Whether the parents are right or wrong filling anything out, it's involuntary. Voluntary on the part of the parents, but involuntary on the part of the child. Not done by choice, unintentional. No intent. In order for a crime to be committed, when there's an informant involved, which the majority of these birth records even refer to the signing off of the parent as an informant. Well, if there was no intention, there could be no crime. So involuntary relate to being unintentional, no intent. You must have intent to commit a crime. How could a child have intent to commit a crime? So if this is possibly framing a child, the other one that is given the relief would actually be absolving the child, which is why the child's so protected in our law. Not consciously controlled, automatic, as digestion is involuntary. So, a volunteer is no profit. No profit in volunteering. When someone volunteers for something, we know when someone says, oh, would you like to volunteer? Usually it's not an intent to get a paycheck. So interestingly, all the volunteers who walked into the third-party social insurance registration or Social Security expected somehow they're going to get paid. Well, there was nothing on the application that said they were going to get paid. So whatever they get is just going to be what it's going to be. And it means whoever gave it to them could take it away, because they'd have full right. What do you think that people's bank accounts can be seized overnight? Why can they freeze that? And the reason they're freezing it is because they're working for the creditors who are liquid. Because all the governments basically originally represented a sovereignty, and the sovereignty pledged the arms as security, because how could you control people who owe you money without controlling their arms? So they controlled their arms, they pledged them as security, and they froze that. It's theirs. So the government's under a freeze. Their accounts are frozen. The innocent child could never be in any quandary in that, or any concern, because his account would be frozen too. Because we know that a child can't even make a decision until. So his accounts are always frozen, so he'd be under the control of a trustee. Now, we decide to not follow this, then we end up working for third-party liability. We're working now for the source that insures the participation game, which now we say we're liquid, because in order to have money, you'd have to be liquid. So we work for the creditor. Well, the creditor just gave us a position as an agent for the creditor. It has nothing to do with being a beneficiary. So we're working as an agent for the principal of a organization that we once before this, if we had never participated, would have been civilly dead. But the minute we breach out of that or break out of that position of identity, we're automatically going to be deemed to be something different. So they create another birth name under a 9-digit number. And at that stage, because the civil death certificate was pledged or mortgaged into it voluntarily, so we gave up that, which was once our position of protection. We left the public to go into the private, and now we're no longer protected. And therefore, we say we will work off that debt, whatever that may have been, that was already expunged or erased, or said was satisfied, and therefore there was no requirement of performance, which is what an accord and satisfaction is, which is mainly what the statement of birth and the birth certificate short form represent. The birth certificate is really a receipt that the debt is paid. Then we go and walk and say, no, the debt's not paid. We'll protest that, and we'll now start working for the banker and say, we'd like to be liquid. We do not want to be under protection of receivership. So therefore we walk into another position of identity, because the one that has already been protected, it's already done, it's satisfied, it's done, it's complete, it's over. You can't redo this. So we walk into a fictional idea of working under a fiction for the creditor, who says, great, if you want to go and pretend that you can pay off a debt that I've already accepted as paid, go ahead. Go knock yourself out. But you get absolutely nothing at the end. Absolutely zero. So this is what we're dealing with right now, and the word volunteer is extremely important. I want you to go and do all the research you can on the word voluntary and involuntary. I found the word volunteer interesting in the opposite. It says composed of volunteers as an army, leading right back to military all of a sudden. The first definition found in the Webster's. Serving as a volunteer, of a volunteer or volunteers. Voluntary. In botany, growing from self-sown. Remember, a man will reap what he sows, right? Or naturally fallen seed. Now you know that man was even referred to almost as fallen seed. As the fallen angels that sinned and left their original position, so did man. He left his original position to become almost fallen seed, in a sense, to go and follow something that eventually would bring him into the actual opposition to God. And therefore, at opposition between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So you can imagine that we're carrying both in the name. the seed of the serpent being those of Adamic sin, and the seed of the woman leading, of course, to Christ. So we have the Christian seed in our name, and we also carry both. But when we cut loose, we will actually be crushing by making a conscientious position of moral faith to break free and come forward as heirs to the promise. Well, then we already have the promise because it's already set forth. The promise is done. Not when we're operating in sin, though. So the actual inheritance is there waiting, but if you do not see it, you will be blinded by your own participation in an opposite direction. The videos that will proceed on this, I think, will bring further clarity, but I do recommend that you get into as much research as you can of the word volunteer and voluntary. And we'll be dealing with another video that will be dealing strictly on equity.